have discussed the basic anatomy of a neuron, let's talk about how we classify neurons. So we can classify neurons either structurally or functionally. When we classify anything structurally, we're talking about how it looks. In the case of a neuron, how many processes are going to and from the cell body? Is the process myelinated or not? On one end, is there a set of peripheral processes or not? On the other hand, when we classify something functionally, we're talking about what it does. How is it functioning in the system? In the case of neurons, we're talking about whether that neuron is sensory, motor, or an interneuron, okay? So let's talk first about the structural classification of neurons. There are 3 types of neurons when we classify them structurally. There are multipolar neurons, unipolar neurons, and bipolar neurons. The multipolar neuron is the one we looked at on the previous page. It's your most common of all of the neurons. It's the most abundant, as we'll see, because of its function as well. And a multipolar neuron has many processes, so many dendrites that attach directly to the cell body. And then a single myelinated axon extends away from the cell body. When we look at the functional classification, we will see that multipolar neurons compose all motor neurons and all interneurons. So that's a lot of the neurons in your body. Unipolar neurons, on the other hand, have a cell body that resides sort of in between this long process. And that long process is divided into the side that's on the receiving end and then the side that's on the sending end. So the receiving end of a unipolar neuron is more specifically called a peripheral process. We don't call it a dendrite. And the reason is because it's actually myelinated. And anything that's myelinated is an axon. And so this long process called the axon, now we will say, has a peripheral process. And that is the receptive end. That's the end that's going to reside in the tissue site. Those receptive ends will receive information. They will be stimulated by a stimulus. If those receptive ends are in your skin, they will respond to touch or temperature or pain. If those receptive ends reside in your tongue, for example, they will respond to a chemical for the special sense of taste. If those receptive ends reside in your inner ear, they will respond to sound. Now, once those receptive ends are stimulated by a stimulus, that action potential is generated across that axon towards the cell body, passes the cell body, and then proceeds along that central process. That central process leads into the spinal cord, if it's a spinal nerve, or into the brain if it's a cranial nerve. And then that end point of the central process, those terminal boutons of the central process, will synapse on another neuron. Unipolar neurons, as we'll see when we talk about them functionally, compose all sensory neurons, okay? A bipolar neuron is structurally different from the unipolar neuron and the multipolar neuron. Now, that cell body resides in between a dendrite and an axon. And so on one side is very specifically now a dendrite. It's not a myelinated axon. It's not a peripheral process. It is a dendrite. And at the end of that single dendrite are lots of individual dendrites that then merge to that single dendrite, sending that information towards the cell body. Remember, the dendrite is the receiving end of the stimulus. Now, once that action potential is generated across that cell body, it will proceed along the axon, similar to a multipolar neuron, and then synapse on another neuron. Bipolar neurons are fairly rare in the body. They're found in the eye and the nose, and we'll see them in this unit when we talk about our special senses. Now let's talk about the functional classification of neurons. Of course, we have to now overlap our understanding of the structural classification of neurons with our functional classification of neurons. So when we talk about the functional classification of neurons, we divide them into three categories. A neuron is either a sensory neuron, an interneuron, or a motor neuron. Sensory neurons bring information towards the central nervous system. All sensory neurons are unipolar neurons, okay? Once that sensory neuron enters into the central nervous system, that central process will synapse on a interneuron. All interneurons are multipolar neurons. Interneurons are located within the central nervous system. They're going to be sandwiched between sensory and motor neurons. So they're within the central nervous system. Interneurons will synapse at some point on a motor neuron. Motor neurons then take information to an effector, either a muscle or a gland. So there's a target organ that will cause that target organ to contract if it's a muscle or secrete if it's a gland. Now, all motor neurons are also multipolar neurons. So in summary, we classify neurons both structurally and functionally. Structurally, there are three types: a multipolar neuron, a unipolar neuron, and a bipolar neuron. Functionally, we classify neurons into three categories: either sensory neuron, interneuron, or motor neuron. Now, all sensory neurons are unipolar neurons. All interneurons and motor neurons are multipolar neurons. Bipolar neurons are rare, located in the eye and the ear, and they are special sensory neurons.